realized this is a great technology to use in volleyball. And so we started adopting this technology into Team Alberta over the last 3 summers. And so I'll let David introduce himself now.
Sure. Thanks, Carlin. Yeah, my name's David Gill. So I run the performance lab for Vert. And as she said, we're down here in South Florida. So it's pretty chaotic time, obviously. But what we did is actually University of Calgary was our first ever research partner. So for those of you who don't know, very briefly, Vert is it's a performance-based wearable little sensor. It was the first IMU to be clinically validated by the University of Calgary, actually, to measure vertical displacement or jump height and jump count. And as a short story, the original intent, and this is before my time, I've been with the company now for about 4 years, was to just kind of allow people to show off and measure the jump height. But then some volleyball coaches started asking us, can it count the jumps? Fast forward, we became basically a volleyball company for the last 6 years. I got in about 4 years ago. Similar to Carlin, my background is exercise science and physiology. So my job has been to take the data we're collecting, which has grown over time, and essentially figure out how best to apply it. And I guess to kind of go into how Carlin and I got into this whole return to play thing, when all of this happened, I had a colleague of mine down here in South Florida reached out to me and had asked, he said a bunch of strength coaches were coming together and they were trying to figure out, what are the best protocols or guidelines we can create for bringing deconditioned athletes back, right? Athletes they've had the most time off from any kind of structured training they've had in practically their entire lives. So when he called me, he said, hey, I want someone with a sports science background. Carlin was the first person I called to join me because I was familiar with some of the studies that she's going to go over now that she's been doing with the University of Calgary. But long story short, that's how this kind of all started. It was a bit of a passion project. It wasn't really even vert related. It was pure high schools. But when it comes to volleyball, we do have a ton of data that we'll be sharing with you today. But that's how we all kind of came here.
Okay, so we'll get going on our PowerPoint here.
Kind of a mix of a bunch of other PowerPoints we've put into the project. It's got the information.
So as David said, we basically have been, working over the past few months on figuring out what some of the considerations are for volleyball and how can we safely progress through sport. And so my background in volleyball is working for Team Alberta, but also within Volleyball Canada's organization in youth sports, Dinos, Canuck, and then Ambrose. The lab I work in with the Sport Injury Prevention Research Center, one of the things we've learned is around 30% of youth are quitting sport due to injury. And so one of the big projects that's coming through Alberta right now is called the SHRED study. So there's centers out of Calgary and Edmonton, where we're primarily looking at concussion, but also for all injuries in sports and across a variety of sports. So researchers in our lab are a big collaborative network. We've done youth ice hockey, rugby, soccer, snowboard, and then volleyball. I'm working both junior high and high schools. One of the big challenges right now, as David said, is that we have never been in the situation with athletes not only not being in regular sport and formal training, but their overall physical activity levels are much lower. So when we look at some of the information relating to youth and their physical activity, it can be 15 to 20 hours a week of just general activity from gym class and other things they're doing, in addition to maybe 8 to 12 hours of structured sport training. So overall, like I said, they have a much lower baseline than they would have had a few months ago. And when we look at performance from the strength and conditioning perspective, health is at the foundation of our pyramid of building athletes up. And we want to work on that health, mobility, stability before we jump to some of the sports stuff with capacity and skill. So with sport and recreational injury, we see a big jump in injuries from elementary school to junior high, and then in injuries requiring medical attention from junior high to senior high. So most athletes basically have experienced some type of acute injury, which is an ankle sprain or knee ligament tear, or an overuse injury like a patellar tendinopathy or shoulder tendonitis or lower back issue. And the big thing is that the youth sport-related injuries have increased by 500 to 700% in the last decade, which is why our injury research center even exists. We also know the highest likelihood of injuries for acute injuries are during competition, but then overuse injuries, especially in volleyball, is during practice. The reason why we're seeing, especially in our young athletes, a lot of these issues is related to what's called peak height velocity. So there's windows of time. They're at a higher risk for injury when they have too high of a training load, or we don't progress training load properly. So there's too big of a jump. So for girls, that's especially around 11 to 13 years old, and boys 13 to 15 years. So basically our U16 athletes. And what we find at provincial team is a lot of athletes are showing up to camp with existing injuries that have carried over from school season and club season. And so with Volleyball Alberta, we've really looked to see how can we improve our provincial program to educate and take care of the athletes in that setting, and then how do we help train our at-risk youth. And ultimately, these costs are to performance. So we know we can decrease injury burden, and a lower injury incidence will have higher match readiness, more of our roster and players available. We see that in the professional leagues of sport, final league ranking is higher, points per match, and success in tournaments. Anecdotally, with Team Alberta, we have seen the same thing in being able to have more of our players and athletes available for training throughout the year. So at provincial camp, not having 10, 15 kids sitting off on the sidelines, to now maybe we're modifying practice for some athletes, and there's very minimal acute injuries and less trips to the emergency room, which is very nice for us organizers working in it. So in volleyball, the main injuries we're looking at for overuse would be shoulder, lower back, and knee. For acute injuries, ankle and knee. The biggest issue we've seen for most athletes is knee injuries, which is why when we're very interested in looking at jump load. The other thing we want to look at with the athletes when we talk about that health pyramid is our strength training and neuromuscular training programs. So when we go back to this injury chart here, you'll see that, okay, the whole body is something we do need to look at holistically with these injuries. And so what neuromuscular training is basically movement training to help kids with their movement skills and improve the connection from their brain to their muscles and improve stability for things that David will talk about a bit more later, which is our jumping and landing. And our mechanics are extremely important, especially when you start to see some of the jump numbers that these kids are going through. And so what the research has shown is that when you have regular participation in the balance and training programs with a resistance training component, we see a reduced likelihood of injury. So in our young athletes, just doing the 12 weeks of the neuromuscular training, it's about 10 to 15 minutes. In phys ed classes, we saw a 70% decrease in all sport injury, 69% in lower limb, 73% in ankle sprains, and 64% in knee sprains. So we know for acute injuries, this is a really good strategy. And neuromuscular training is something Volleyball Alberta has been talking quite a bit about for the past few years because as we've learned as this evidence. So we on our website have some suggested neuromuscular training programs which embody these components of aerobic, strength and mobility, agility and balance. So our strength things being things like lunges, Nordic hamstring curls, front planks, side planks, so creating better torso stability. Agility, looking at single leg hopping mechanics, proper jumping mechanics, and single leg landing mechanics. And then balance training, so again, single leg. And especially in volleyball, in youth, this is incredibly important because as we've observed over the years, our youth athletes as they're getting used to their bodies with these growth spurts, they're getting more used to how to use their shoulders and core to hit. And when they aren't doing that, they'll typically land on the single leg more, or for example, if they're late for a block. So ideally, we're teaching 2-foot landings as much as possible. However, we know this is not always what's happening, and it's not always ideal situations in volleyball. So yeah, a middle late for a block, I can promise you they're landing on one leg. Now, for neuromuscular training, there's a lot of great resources out there. And like I said, I'm not going to get too far into it today. But the University of Calgary Sport Injury Center, we have a website with some sports for the neuromuscular training. The other one that's really great is done by Fit to Play, and that's the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Center, which is one of our head Olympic Committee labs, and they have every body part, every injury that you would need to look at, and then same as activeandsafe.ca. So they'll have a link that shows volleyball, and you can look at all of the injury information surrounding volleyball. And if you're really keen, you can go very in depth into that and some of the exercises. And they actually have videos which teach you the exercises and what to do, as well as considerations for how to modify. The great things about these programs is that they can be done at home, and they don't need any equipment. And so, especially in a time when gyms are still closed or athletes may not have the same access as before, how we're reframing for our varsity and youth athletes we're working with is this is a big opportunity right now to actually go back to your fundamental movement skills and work on building your foundation. Now, we can do all that movement training, and we kind of know what to do for acute injuries. Now, with overuse injuries, we haven't seen the same success at this point with some of those injuries. And so then we look at training load as a risk factor for injury. And we know it's very well established in the literature now that rapid increases in training load really put our athletes at risk at pretty much any level, from youth to professional sport. And overuse injuries are what we would actually call a training error injury. So when we look at the changes in training load per week, research out of Australia, there's a lot of it right now, but this is one of the more simple studies. When we look for athletes at a 5 to 10% training load change per week or progression, we see a very low risk of injury. Once we start going to 15 to 20, we start to see that injury risk doubling and then tripling later. And with more advanced athletes, we might look at, a 10 to 15% injury if they're in better shape or don't have a history of significant injury. But whereas with youth athletes, because they've been going through the growth and development and they're a bit more sensitive to the training load changes, we've typically recommended a 5 to 10% change per week. Now, how do we even get these training load numbers? Well, bring in David, who has totally changed the way we look at training in volleyball. And so out of Vert, he's their performance lab director and has a bunch of degrees and is super smart. And he really focuses a lot on the biomechanics. And so basically, like I said, we reached out to him to do some more work with our provincial team and partner with them for our programs to get actual training load data we could work back from. So I'll let him talk now about what Vert can do.
All right, thanks, Carlin. So yeah, as I'd mentioned before, we had that little inertial measurement unit. And again, I'd like to emphasize and re-emphasize those kind of neuromuscular training resources that Carlin went over. Again, that was one of the main reasons I called her. I know she's just a wealth of information, and the fact that a lot of those research institutes just kind of provide this information, I think is something that more people need to take advantage of. In fact, we also partner with Hospital for Special Surgery out of New York, and I'm looking at their neuromuscular training program and the results, and it's all at this stage with the amount of research behind it. It's really a must do. Not just now with everyone coming back from injury, but just in general. If we can at least standardize, 10 to 15 minutes of stability, movement, and getting those just movement quality improvements for that foundation, you're setting yourself up way ahead of basically the curve. So specific to Vert now, this is where we start talking about that chronic or overuse injury. right? If those neuromuscular training protocols are going to help you with that acute injury, it's that on-court load. If you manage that properly, that's where we can see dramatic decreases in injury and increases in performance, right? So you can go ahead and click through these bullet points here, Carl. And as I mentioned, we can, measure vertical jump and height. And so how that's used. Well, volleyball is such a fortunate sport, and I mean this in a few different ways. We got lucky that volleyball sort of embraced us, but in no other sport is there a more direct measure of training load, right? Like we know the highest injury risk is with our front row players, our jumpers, and our landers. And it just so happens that now we can actually measure jumping and landing. And whenever you're planning in any sport, what you're planning for is preparing your athlete to handle their match demands, right? So the main way this is used is we now know at various levels of the sport what the average, and we're going to go over these numbers in a moment, but what the average jump count for a middle per set is, or per match, or for a 4-set match, 3-set match, 5-set match. So we know what we need to prepare the athletes for. And that's how this data now is being utilized. We know what to prepare them for, we can then plan accordingly. I also love that picture. Good angle. So next, as Carlin showed, you have our initial, as I mentioned before, our initial study was actually done with Dr. Kerry McDonald, I'm sure a lot of you probably know. He's now the head of sports science, sports medicine, volleyball. Prior to this, he was at UBC. We have, honestly, probably about a dozen validations at this point. But again, the main thing, which is what's unique about volleyball, is that we've just looked at jump count, pure jump count, jumps over 6 inches. Now we can also look at a lot of other things, such as how hard or how well an athlete's attenuating landing, percent of match, things of that nature. Next slide, please. But so you guys all understand, in case I'm sure some of you have seen it before, some of you haven't. The way it works is the sensor goes around the waist, center of mass. It communicates to an iPad, so it's going to collect all the information and give it to you live. It goes onto our servers from there, and then you can pull different various reports, right? So it's a tool that programs use, at the very bare minimum. It's kind of like motivating your athletes. But again, the key importance of it is injury risk mitigation by allowing a coach to objectively and strategically build that athlete capacity, while also comparing, how are my jump numbers and jump performance in a match to my practice. So this is something we've been talking a lot about over the last, 4 months now. As most of you know, collegiate budgets are pretty much frozen, especially in the States. I know it's a lot the same thing up in Canada. So all that I've been doing with my team is purely things like this, just educating, talking to anyone who cares to listen, who wants to learn more about, hey, what are things I can do in general? Because while we measure all of these physical objective things, we always feel remiss if we don't mention, especially now, the mental aspect. And while we're not going to go into too much detail about it, I think as coaches, though, we just have to recognize that aside from a lot of the athlete's body not being physically ready to go back hard, you have kind of a two stories going on. You have the athletes who mentally are like, I'm ready to go. Let's go. I can handle it. And they're chomping at the bit. And that's where it requires a coach to very definitively hold them accountable and say, yes, I know you feel mentally like you're dying to get out there, but the last thing we want to do is let you go all out because of what we're discussing here. We're going to go into more detail about. So it's just that's something we need to be very, very aware of. So not just education of the coaches, but making sure that you're educating the athletes of, hey, here is why we're doing things the way we are. Because when you do explain them, and actually, I think there's some qualitative research on this, Carlin, that's being done now with your group, is that when you do explain it to them, there's a much higher compliance likelihood. And they're going to be a little less likely to fight you back on it. So, you're building the mental side, and then again, the physical capacity side, your athletes, but the fact of the matter is right now, for the most part, a lot of them are going to be on an even playing ground, right? You sort of, unless you know you've been training them in the off season, you have to assume they've done next to nothing. That's just the safest way we can move forward and build that capacity. So as I was talking about those numbers, right? This is based off of 50 Division I women's programs. It matches up really, really well, actually, with our national teams as well. This is for 5-set matches, because I know there's going to be some 3-set matches in youth play as well. But you're looking at right now 133 jumps, 125 jumps. These numbers specifically, this is when we looked at spring practice in the States. We said, all right, the spring practice here, right, it shut off, kind of mid-March. I don't even remember at this point. They missed a little over a month. So what we did is we said, all right, what are they missing right now? Not just from a physical standpoint, from a skill standpoint, just for our own knowledge. We found that on average, middles were missing about 133 jumps a day and outsides about 125 jumps a day. Now, that's important because when strength coaches are starting to send work home to their athletes, I know that happens a lot too. You're saying you're giving recommendations to your athletes of what they can do at home. We weren't going to send home, hey, you normally would have jumped 133 times today in practice, so I want you to jump 133 times in your apartment. So it's just being aware of, it's what we're missing, but how can we be more efficient in that training? What we found was, and forgive me, I don't even remember if this was on the slide, but we found that on average, the middles were jumping about 28 times above 20 inches, and outsides were jumping about 25 times. Yeah, it is. Yay. So we looked at these numbers and said, all right, so we understand now what are their maximal kind of effort jumps. And this is where we started from to create kind of at-home guidelines. And by the way, I'll be submitting these to you all, so you have kind of what we put together that a lot of our colleges are starting to use, but the same exact concept can be used at every level. You don't need any equipment for it. It's not going to be 150 jumps, so counting will be easy. But the idea is just to say, all right, at least now we can get some of that still going while we're at home and start building up that capacity on our own, so that by the time the athletes do get on the court, they're not at that, not that they'll be at zero, but they're not at that lower capacity number.
So this is just to go over a bit of the Volleyball Alberta numbers we've seen. And again, you'll see there's variation within weekly totals of athletes, but we are able to group them positionally, as David talked about, so he kind of went over middles. But setters, they're one of the other ones. When we look at sub-maximal jumps, we look at a totally different set of numbers for them. So with some of the kids that have a specialized position, depending on the age group you're talking about, so maybe 17 and 18, we are looking at different load requirements. So at the collegiate level, we do recommend different jump load parameters sometimes for our setters, just because there aren't as many maximal jumps. And we do a bit more movement work. So for example, in 12 days of Team Alberta Camp in summer 2018, over 2,000 jumps in 12 days. And that was, again, in a controlled setting. We had an idea by this point of what to work back from to actually build them up to be able to tolerate that. So just what David is talking about, we've already been putting some of these into practice in the provincial team level of working backwards with some of our summer programs we share with them.
Yeah, so if we talk about that athlete resiliency, the landing piece, that's kind of what that visual is, to give you an idea of how we measure that. And Carl, you can go and pull up all the bullet points on this one. So this is something that's critical for coaches, and I think athletes to understand as well, is when we're talking about building physical capacity, you're going to have some of these athletes come back and day two, they're jumping almost the same as they were the season before. They look good. They feel good. But the fact is, muscles, develop faster. They love rest. The tendons and ligaments, however, that's not really the case. Tendon load, or tendon capacity rather, tends to really lag behind that muscular capacity, especially if we're looking at high plyometric movements, right? And so we're looking at plyometric movements. You're thinking about your hops and your rebound jumps and your depth jumps. And what we want to make clear as whenever we have these kind of calls or these talks is, while plyometrics is fantastic for building an athlete's ability to jump and getting some of that stiffness, research has shown that heavy plyometrics actually causes a bigger increase in muscle capacity than in tendon capacity. So what you can be doing is creating kind of an imbalance there. And the way I want you to think about that imbalance in kind of general terms is, if I've got this crazy strong quad muscle that can handle anything, so it's taking these poundings and it's pulling on that patellar tendon, on that tendon that has the minimized capacity rather, right? That's where it leads to some of those tendon dysfunctions, some of those patellar tendinopathies, because it can't keep up with that strain. So that's why you want to make sure you slowly build that load. And a big part of that reason, or a big reason, is so we can have that tendon keep up and strengthen alongside those muscles, so they're working a lot more in harmony. The next thing is that speed of movement, right? So at home, athletes are not going to be able to really mimic what they're doing on the court, that rapid change of direction. Of course, we need to do some things at home to get that capacity built. But really, you're going to get that on the court. So again, start doing those things a little slower. Going back to one of the first slides Carlin showed, you have capacity and skill at the end. We want to get on those, get that functional movement, strength and balance first, and then start working on more of that change of direction, and then start after that implementing some of the actual skill work into practice. And that's what we're referring to when we talk about chaos. And to give credit where it's due, this term, I know it's fairly common, but the strength coach at Florida State University, this is something they love. And they refer to as chaos. Again, as mentioned before, chaos is that one-legged landing that's going to happen because it was a bad set, or they started too late on their block, or they over-rotated on their swing. It's part of the sport. It will never go away. But as a result, you do want to have them train for that. But does that mean I'm going to have them training in their house for, like doing off-balance jumps? Probably not. Wouldn't recommend that. But we know that's going to happen on the court, so we're going to mimic that as much as we can. So the next slide is a bit of a visual. We're going to jump between this one and the next one. Just so when I'm talking about landing impact, I want you all to have a visual understanding of what that means and how we're measuring it. So on here, this is just kind of a view of our server side. The black lines would be your jumps and jump heights. To the left in the y-axis, you have your jump height in inches, and then you have G's. And G's is just a measure of acceleration, essentially against Earth's gravity. So what we did years ago is we were able to normalize different thresholds of what would be considered kind of a low, medium, high, or alert landing. And what I mean by high landing impact is you can see in red there's just a couple marks that are above 20 G's. Anything above 20 G's, our initial research showed, was alert. Like, that person landed ridiculously hard. You can see this athlete had only 11% of all of her landings were over 15. So go to the next one there, Carlin. This was what we've seen, though, quite a bit. And understanding that the red are landing impacts, it's pretty clear this athlete is sitting here at 66% of her landings. I think we're actually above 20, which is the alert category. And again, this was the initial research. We're kind of doing this by hand. And then what we started doing is we kind of went through and looked at a lot of our clients, and it's not shocking. It was astonishing the rate at which we were able to flag higher injury risk athletes. So what this means is when that athlete lands, that red line is giving you a visual of how well they attenuate or absorb that ground force up their legs and into their hips and back, right? So if you have someone who's landing in the low category, it doesn't mean good. I can't see, knee valgus, right? But this athlete is consistent and attenuating that landing impact up to the center of mass. And as you might imagine, this athlete is a very rarely injured athlete. The next one, that was an interesting experience. This is actually one of the first athletes that we flagged, and I called them the program, and I said, hey, I don't want to scare anybody, but theoretically, I would anticipate this person might have a higher likelihood of hip and back pain. The first year we did that, there were 12 such athletes we flagged. 11 of the 12 ended up having those pretty specific issues. The one that didn't, and again, this goes to what we've been talking about, the one that didn't have that issue who landed hard, she jumped 40% less volume wise than the average outside hitter in Division I volleyball. They just knew she landed hard, and they kind of kept her within a range that worked for her, that kept her performance up. So again, it's about finding that capacity and then working from there. So next, this one was really, really, I'll just use the word fun, but it's eye-opening, where as you can see here, these are, 8 to 10 to 12-inch jumps, and yet the landing impacts relative to their higher jumps was really, really high. And we started noticing, we asked a lot of our clients to tag, because you can tag on our platform, what they were doing. And what we noticed almost across the board was that serves, even float serves, were the hardest landing impact most of these athletes did. And why this was so eye-opening is we found this in the middle of having we'll call it a discussion more so than a debate with a few of our clients. They were having arguments themselves saying like, hey, we don't want to count our serves and our jump load because our numbers get too high and we want to get our jumps in. But then when we kind of stumbled upon this and we saw with about 80 different programs, this was the case with the majority of their athletes. Yeah, not only should you count serves, but with certain athletes, you're telling them like, hey, with this particular athlete, you might count that as 2 jumps because she just lands hard. And that's not to say we need to necessarily change how they're landing. What we found is it's more just part of the movement. There's a lot of that horizontal displacement. They're a bit more piked. They're hitting more flat-footed and getting into position. So again, it's not to say that we can't work on it, but it's more be aware, because too often times coaches will bring athletes back from injury and say, hey, let's start them off with some serves. And then too many times I hear about them saying, yeah, they got re-injured. We never even got through our serve protocol. Like, well, serve protocol for that particular athlete may actually have been more damaging than working on blocks to start. So that's just a piece of information to be aware of as you're kind of planning your practices. So this is our proportion of work chart. Rob Perinello, a gentleman down in the States, he created this. Carlin and I absolutely love it. That's a simple visual of, again, gradually bringing those athletes back. And so one of the things we've talked about with the project we were doing for high schools down in Florida is, and again, it goes back to that chart Carlin talked about in the very beginning of the presentation, is when they come back in, what we need to do first is, in general numbers, we're talking about like even our college programs, it's like an 80-20 to start. 80% of what they're doing is general conditioning, movement, balance, stability, and then 20% is more working on your sport and working on practice. And then week over week, as you move, you kind of start to see that shift, right? And toward later on, when the season's getting ready to start, you're doing a lot more practice, but you're still doing maybe 80% practice, 20% of that still general movement prep, those neuromuscular training programs, which again, the research has supported. Don't just do it in practice, try to do it before the matches as well. We know that's harder on tournaments, right, Carlin? But it's key, because then the body gets into the habit kind of priming itself, balancing, stimulating the central nervous system, and then boom, ready to perform optimally, moving as best as possible. So this is just a great visual that you all can use to kind of give you an idea of this sort of sliding scale where you start with that general movement prep and conditioning, and then you move into more skill-specific training with your team. And this is one of the guidelines the NSCA put together. And this, you all have this, so I'm not going to go into it in a ton of detail. And again, a lot of these guidelines have changed. They continue to change. Carlin, I don't know if you've seen it, but I just got an email from our return to play group in Florida. I just got version number 6 sent. And just so you know, when we talk about, right now we're talking specifically about deconditioned athletes, building capacity. But the guidelines we did create with our colleagues down here, they include for teachers, coaches, parents. We'll share those with everyone as well, just so you can see it as an administrator. If some of you I know are also teachers, it's like 131 pages though. So heads up, because it's unbelievably comprehensive. But again, it's just to answer as many questions as we can to make sure everyone's on kind of an even playing field as we come back trying to combat these added challenges. All right, so I guess part of our conclusion, and this is something that, again, our entire sports science group, we had some folks from UC San Diego, Lauren Green. I like to give credit where credit's due. He's an amazing sports scientist there. Carlos Daniel, who's the head of strength conditioning for Vanderbilt basketball. Joe Janoski, again, he's the head of kind of development for the Hospital for Special Surgery. They have a great program that's free. That's just for basically trying to mitigate injury risk. Natasha Gottlieb with Florida State University, and then Eric Ferran, Director of Sports Performance for the Miami Heat. Those are some of the folks that we worked with to put all these things together. And again, to try to simplify and ask that amount of information, is these are some of the main things that you should focus on and be aware of when you're bringing your athletes back. We don't need to go too much into the targeted isometrics, though for some of your athletes that is going to be important. But again, working up those volumes, I cannot stress enough, getting some of those standardized neuromuscular training programs in there, I think is critical. And then build on-court, on-field training loads. Again, we have 10 to 15% in there. That is going to be for more your higher level athletes. If you are working with more youth athletes, the research would support staying closer to 5 to 10%. And then some of these simple at-home resources that, again, Carlin has some of those. I can share some more as well, to make sure that, again, we just have the tools we can, because we have to recognize that even with high schools in the States, I would imagine it's the same in parts of Canada where offerings and resources are limited, right? So we need to make sure that we provide a lot of things, a lot of options for athletes that require virtually no equipment. Like you can see my really fancy gym here in my house. Those bands kept me active for the last 3.5 months. So, but yeah, these are the main points we really focused on to make sure that you can help reduce both those acute and chronic overuse injuries. All right.
Okay, so I think that's everything we had scheduled to go over for today. So I think we can open up for questions now.
Yeah, perfect. So if anyone has questions, you can just type them into the chat and we'll address them that way. And maybe just as people are thinking about that or typing in their questions, so in terms of a progression for an athlete to get back into it outside of just the general physical and conditioning, if you're recommending they do some jump training to prepare for on-court training, is the idea to do more high repetition, maybe sub-maximal jumps, or a different process where they might be doing some plyometric jumping or a combination there within? What would be, I guess, a good prescription for coaches to recommend to their athletes when it speaks to, preparing for their load with on-court training? What kind of a jump training program would be good to shape?
Carlin, you want to start that one off and then I'll jump on in? Pun intended, I guess.
For sure. I think it depends a bit on the age of the athlete and also, like I said, what they have been doing in the past few months. As we talked about the sliding scale and what David was saying about the plyometric activity being more intense, typically what I would do is start them off with the jump training and agility training provided in the neuromuscular training programs. And they do have built-in progressions to get them going. So there is a mix of, like I said, of the sub-maximal jumping initially, especially the first few weeks, to start getting the tendon strength up. Because as David said, the muscle strength comes a lot more easily and quickly. And the biggest issue is most of us, so our connective tissue and tendons, they take longer to adapt than the muscle. And so when we look at that sliding scale and the percentages of change, when we give out these programs, we have that in consideration with the repetitions and the number of sets, and going from there. Now, with an injured athlete, I'm very, very conservative if they've had pain or any issues. So I would, again, make sure there's enough rest days also in between some of these jump programs or skill sessions to recover. And I would do definitely like a 5% increase at a time. And that again could be increasing the number of repetitions, increasing the difficulty of the exercise. So, but yeah, with the, like I said, with the youth, we usually do a mixture of the strengthening and the agility and the plyometric. We don't tend to just pick from one bin because, again, for their general movement skill and athletic development, and then also to challenge the body and tissues differently, we don't want to ignore a whole area, because that's technically then how we would see an overuse injury showing up.
Yeah, and just to add on, when you're talking about, we talk about plyometrics, right? You have varying levels of plyometrics, and I know a lot of the resources they have will go through those varying level of plyometrics. So, for example, if you have someone, like some of the jump numbers to start at, like even with practice, some of that almost becomes slightly arbitrary. So we did a really neat study a few years ago where we looked at programs in the spring. And we looked at how they periodized their jump training in the spring. And the results were almost comical in that what happened was we had about almost a dozen programs that started their spring practices at like 50 jumps, very low. And then they did a really nice progression of roughly 10 to 15% week over week for 5 weeks. Every one of those programs ended the spring with a 1.2 to 1.3 inch increase in their average vertical. The programs that started at 90 to 100 jumps and then had really no progression ended up with a 1.2 inch decrease in vertical. And that's where I say that the results were almost comical, but that's what we saw. And part of the reason, there's going to be a number of variables there, right? Because all we're looking at are the jump numbers. But again, a lot of folks tend to think of, the muscle and stability for the jump, but that tendon, especially that energy tendon, is going to play a really big role on ground reaction. So if you do have tendon dysfunction, you aren't going to jump as high. So again, we're going to use that to say, when you're looking at your plyometrics, like those low level kind of, small hops, those are fantastic to do those. And you can do those daily for a few minutes. That in and of itself is going to be great for helping to keep that tendon capacity up. But if you're doing those like kind of maximally, that's dramatically more impactful. But you do need to combine them, right? So you do some of those, get prepped, and then you can throw in some maximal jumps. And it doesn't need to be a lot, especially to start. And when I say it doesn't need to be a lot, some of the ones we've done for some of our college clients that we recommended was they were starting with like something like 3 sets of 4 block jumps and 3 sets of 4 approach jumps, just to kind of move through it. And then week over week, doing something as simple as adding a set. But again, it depends on your time frame, right? How long do we have for that first match or first practice? So what do you, again, what you're building for. Depending on how long, that will determine kind of where you can start from the jump number. If you have a long time, you can start low, great, and then build.
Yeah, so this kind of relates to a question someone just sent me, which is how do I address peer coaches that are preparing to go straight into a crazy 100% push the limits regime when allowed? Specifically, coaches who first respond to the objection, their kids, they're going to be fine, make up for lost time. And I like kind of relate it just back to what David just said about the fact that we can actually see a better performance increase. So sometimes with coaches, I know I'm talking about the physiology of getting the better performance out of them. The other thing, another question came in that was, would this discussion change for younger ages, specifically U13 girls? And again, these are athletes who have just, the U13 girls specifically have just gone through their peak height velocity. So they are even more susceptible to injury and overuse injury at that time. So again, I would say being very conservative with them. But David is always talking to coaches about this kind of stuff. So what would your response be to, okay, well, yeah, they're kids, or like, how do we deal with that 100% go all out, as you referred
to? Constantly. Now, aside from kind of throwing the research in their face, which frankly, we're providing you that so you can diplomatically do just that, especially in my position, right? So I'm part of a business, so I can't sit here and tell a coach, hey coach, you're destroying your athletes. Have to be a bit more tactful. And so a lot of that is just saying, things such as, when do you want to have your best play, right? When is it most important to be playing your best? Virtually all coaches say, middle, tail end, and then into the season's where you want to be strongest. Okay, so we need to build up to that. That's one of the first things I say is if you can build up, because the fact of the matter is, and there is an asinine amount of research to back this up, you can, for lack of a better term, ruin the season by starting too high and never being able to recover. But you're never going to do that if you start too low, and maybe your first few matches you're not where you want to be. But again, as Dr. Claire McDonald loves to say, the best ability is availability. And at this point too, I imagine a lot of the coaches out there probably have a fair amount of just personal stories and anecdotes. I mean, I straight up tell people, it's funny when you look at the research Carlin put out about the age groups. I was one of those athletes. By the age of 15, my swimming career ended because I closed the door and shredded my rotator cuff. But it was an acute injury, but it was purely from overtraining. So yeah, that's a challenge. That's something that Carlin and I kind of live and breathe every day. But this whole COVID scenario, if we look at the silver lining, has brought that to a lot more coaches' attention. Because the other thing to say is, hey, when you're talking to your peers, you say, look, this is what we're doing. This is what they're doing. You educate the parents and the coaches on why you're doing it. Eventually those coaches will have to do it too. Honestly, their hands will kind of be forced. But use those resources that we're providing, because I think it's just, it's kind of hard to argue against at this point. And then I did see the question there. I'll talk about this a little bit, and then Carlin, you kind of built the sheet. We recognize that, VERT is a technology and it costs money. It's the same thing when we did these high school return to play protocols. Wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone could have it? Obviously, I'd agree. But realistically, we know that's not the case. So one of the other ways of doing this, and again, I'll let Carlin go into more detail about it, and we'll provide, I do have the finalized sheet from Lauren, Carlin, that I'll send over to everyone, is the concept of RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, which is a way for coaches to very, very easily, and it's very effective, a very easy way of monitoring load. But Carlin, I'll let you take on that one.
Sure. So I just put the link in the chat there for people they can go to as part of our Return to Play project. We've actually just created a series of videos on RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion, which is using what's called like internal load monitoring. So it's how hard the athletes feel they're working to monitor their return to training. And so the great thing about using this, we've actually done this with our Team Alberta athletes. And one of the things that's neat is we've been able to, line up the jump load numbers with the internal load. And because volleyball, 4 out of the 5 skills are jumping, RPE and jump load or count are very closely connected. And so when we can do an inexpensive method, which is basically on a scale of 1 to 10, I rate, okay, how hard or easy was that practice? And then we multiply that by the duration of the practice. Then we get what's called their RPE score. And actually a lot of the original research I presented in earlier was based on internal load. And some of the best data supporting training load monitoring is actually in the subjective feeling of how hard the athlete was working. And the reason why is that takes into account what's called a moderator of fitness. So for example, your less fit athletes are going to be reporting sometimes higher numbers for a session than maybe a fitter athlete would. And I can tell you 100% this is what has happened at provincial camp. with our fitter athletes or the ones that did their homework and came in a bit more prepared, they tolerated that training load a lot better. And the great thing about RPE is you can use a piece of paper and write it down and do it that way. You can use the Google or Excel sheets, which we can provide the resources for. But yeah, it's great to know also and see the variation across athletes of what you'll report in a practice. So again, maybe you work the middles a bit harder that practice. Maybe you worked your liberos a bit more. That then fine tunes and allows you to individualize for a certain athlete. Maybe if they're injured or they've been sick or they had bad sleep, maybe their stress is going on, as David referred to. The mental side of this right now is very disorienting for a lot of people and athletes, even if they may not totally recognize it yet. And so that score will take into account not only the physical load, but yeah, how they're feeling. So there's tons of information on that on the website link there that hopefully can get you guys going on how we would look at that from just a youth training perspective, but also in the research world.
Yeah, and we're also going to have some of those resources, and we're creating just a place to house it. We're actually going to be adding it as just a page on the Vert site. I hope to have that ready by the end of the week. And when we do, we'll kind of send that out. And so again, it's going to be a resource about the project. The guidelines will actually be on that page as well, if anybody wanted to see what we did for the high school return to play here. But then we'll have the videos and we'll have the Excel spreadsheet. So basically Carlin and Lauren did all the work for you, and it's really simple. You just kind of plug in the numbers. It'll give you the grabs. It'll give you acute to chronic workload ratios. It's pretty comprehensive, and frankly, it's actually really, really easy. It doesn't take a lot of time.
Great. Well, I think we'll slowly wrap this up. But one last question, just as it relates to the last bit. Does it also help just with doing RPE scores to test their jumps at the beginning of the season and periodically throughout the season, just to see if they're seeing increases, decreases, or if they're just maintaining their jump maximums? Does that give an indication in combination with the RPE scores if you've seen a drop in their vertical jumps as well, and whether and how much you should be limiting their participation or their exertion rates?
Well, and I think Carl and I just talked about this not too long ago. You have RPEs, and then you also have pain scales, like pain scores, like, rate your knee 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, rate your ankle pain or hip pain. Some of the research I've seen, the pain scales have kind of worked closer to that, but not to open up a can of worms, that one's tough in general, just because what ends up happening is jump height on the court isn't always a phenomenal indicator of fatigue. Sometimes you're like, hey, your jump height's the same, our jump count was normal, but your RPE is higher. That's, then maybe it typically is for this practice or against your, other players in your position, something like that. That's where I'd start to look at it. Because when you look at jump height, honestly, especially with better athletes, even when they're fatigued, oftentimes they can still jump as high. It just, their eccentric load, that kind of loading phase, maybe a little bit longer. What we've seen actually is a better objective measure of fatigue has been honestly in the landing side, right? It's been more of, as the athletes fatigue, they don't want to squat as much on that landing to absorb. They take pressure off the muscular structure and they put it on their skeletal structure instead by stiffening their landing. So that has been a more direct correlation with the objective side. But yeah, it's not always as clear as like, hey, your RPE went up and your jump height went down, right? That can happen, but it's just more of again, looking at that trend of that particular player. And then, you can, after a while, compare them to their same positions. Like, hey, these practices are usually the same for these two players. All right, now it's closer to comparing apples to apples, because RPE is kind of an individualistic thing. But I do recommend when you find athletes that are, kind of very similar in the trend, that's when you can start to notice things like that. Like, why suddenly are you saying practices are getting harder and the rest of the team saying they're getting easier? That's where the flag would kind of pop up.
Yeah, and I would say, especially teams when you don't have the access to the vert, like is good to jump test throughout the season more than what I've typically seen happen in many programs. And so having, but again, it needs to be taken within a context of what you're doing in training. So for example, if I know I'm putting them through a base phase of training of we're trying to actually induce a lot of fatigue to then have the adaptation, I might expect some numbers to come down a little bit for a certain period of time, because they are fatigued, but we need to build that base and get that foundation to then have our training adaptation of like when we unload them. And so that's when you get into some of the different like undulating periodizations where you load and unload and that sort of thing. For example, at Team Alberta one year, the girls were going through a heavy phase of training and they all got upset that their jump numbers were going down. And they're like, I'm doing so bad today. And, that sort of thing. But then we again explained the context that, well, your coaches actually have intended for us to be overloaded a bit more right now so that we can peak at a later time. So you definitely, can get, like as David said, into a bit of a wormhole, on some of these things. But I would just say in general, from what I've observed over the years, is most programs just in general need to improve their baseline testing and maybe like their in or mid season and what those metrics could be. And for youth, like I said, we're learning more and more about it. So when you can't, have the landing ones, sometimes they'll do vertical jump before and after practice to even see if there's that difference, which might be a bit more pronounced in youth. But again, we're learning a lot about it still. Volleyball, we're getting more and more funding to learn about this and answer more questions and keep improving on that knowledge base.
Great. Well, just on behalf of Volleyball Alberta, I'd like to thank David and Carlin for this presentation and this great information. And like we said earlier in the presentation, we've recorded this and we'll have that posted with some additional resources on our website. So thanks to everyone for joining in the call, and have a great day.
Thank you.
You guys.
Our pleasure.
And Carlin, if you want, you can pass over the hosting controls to me if you like. And
okay, how do I? Oh,
so if you go to my name,
go.
I'm the other Volleyball Alberta one.
Awesome. Okay, I got it.
I am now. Perfect.
So Jim, what I'll do is I'll also make sure you guys have some of these just other kind of general match reports, things of that nature that I think people will find helpful in terms of the targets they need to kind of reach at to get the kids ready for. And then anything else you guys need, feel free to let me know.
That's great. Yeah, any additional resources that you guys are able to share is perfect, and then we can just provide that, and we'll definitely include the link that Carlin added to the chat box. But then you had also mentioned that you guys were updating that one.
Yeah, we're we've got so much, and so I wanted to kind of consolidate a lot of it. And we were looking at building a little splash page, and then we're like, forget it, let's just throw it onto the website. We'll just create a little page for it. And it's going to have just videos of some of the coaches who started the project down here. It'll have the link to those videos